It's very funny that I've been basically recording videos for like the last 4 hours trying to get something down that I wanted to actually put out. And I keep going back and forth. But anyways, the way I'm going to do this is in this video, I want to talk about the new dungeon pool that we have finally have been confirmed by Ian Hazzikostas, thanks to WoWhead for putting out the article. And it was an interview between Ian Hazzikostas and some site I'm trying to think of. I can't remember. And buffed.de. I think it's a German like news reporting site. Anyways, they did an interview with Ian Hazzikostas. WoWhead has kind of put together just the list for us. And I want to go over in this dungeon quickly what I think about the dungeon pool and how they're basically implementing this. Like, I mean, it's been about 2-ish years now, a little bit more than 2 years that we've had a rotating dungeon pool. And I kind of want to take a look back and see the pros and cons of each. And then what I'm going to do probably in separate videos is I'm going to walk down like a little memory lane. I'm going to go through each dungeon on heroic, normal, mythic difficulty, whatever I can do to walk through how the dungeons feel and some of my concerns. So I'm going to probably do those in separate videos. So if you like or want to see that, just make sure you subscribe. I don't like doing this like weird like and subscribe bullshit. But anyways, enjoy the video. Let's talk about it. The season 2 is going to be coming out probably like, I would say earliest end of January, probably I'm guessing mid-February at the latest, like early March, but I'm gonna rough ballpark estimate February. So we're gonna have a new dungeon pool, new raid, new zone, all of that stuff. And Blizzard is doing a good job adapting and trying to break the status quo from what we're used to seeing. So we're used to seeing a rotating dungeon pool at this point. Basically, we see 4 dungeons of the 8 of the new dungeons, I should say, in the War Within in the first season. Predictably, in the second season, we're gonna see the other 4. That is hit right on the nose. We're going to be seeing Cinderbrew Meadery, Dark Flame Cleft, the Rookery, and Priori of the Sacred Flame. Now, that's predictable. What's not predictable is some of the things that they have announced and are doing. So first off, they're bringing out a new dungeon called Operation Floodgate. It's not a mega dungeon. It's gonna, I'm assuming, a 4-boss dungeon. It could be 3, it could be 5. Not sure yet. We don't really have too many details unless I've missed something. But basically, for the first time ever since the inception of Mythic Plus, we're seeing a new dungeon get released, and it's going to be available in Mythic Plus right away, which is going to be very fun. So I'm excited to test out this new dungeon. I think that's great. Another thing that we haven't seen before is they're introducing, for the second time being recycled, I should say, Operation Mechagon Workshop. Now, Operation Mechagon was a mega dungeon in BFA that was released towards, middle of BFA and was implemented as Mythic Plus towards the end. It was a hard mode dungeon, kind of standard. It was then reworked into the Mythic Plus pool in Shadowlands in the Mega Dungeon season, in the Fated season, essentially. And we saw Karazhan, the Mega Dungeon, both wings. We saw Operation Mechagon, Tazavesh. This is the first time we saw like a rotating season. It was the first time they tried it, and I think ever since it's been great, and they've implemented on it. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But basically, we've seen Operation Mechagon twice already, and now they're bringing it back for a third time. And when they announced the first 6 dungeon of the season a couple days ago, I've been really thinking about like what dungeons could they bring back that would be relatively thematic and work well into the season. And my first thought was Mechagon. I was like, Mechagon would be great, but they've already done it, so I doubt they'll bring it back. And lo and behold, to probably a lot of people's surprise, we are seeing this dungeon again. And I'm going to be doing a full breakdown video running through that dungeon, talking about some of the pain points, talking about the boss mechanics generally. And then I'll be doing full boss guides in the future. But very cool. So 2 new things they're doing. They're bringing back a dungeon again for the second time, and they're bringing in a new dungeon. I'm a big fan of this. And then they've already announced the Motherlode is going to be making a return. And so you're going to see me in game here. I'm actually hanging out in the Motherlode. I ran through. I wanted to talk about all like the kind of nuanced like mechanics and take a little trip down memory lane. But we're getting this dungeon again, and then we're getting Theater of Pain, which I think is interesting. So let's talk about these dungeons briefly, some things that I'm concerned for, some things I'm excited for, and just generally nerd out. I don't want this video to be too long, and specific dungeon breakdowns will be in probably separate videos. Let's just dive into this. So we don't know much about the new dungeon, Operation Floodgates, but so I can't really talk about it too much. I don't know how many bosses are going to be. I don't know what the trash is going to look like. I don't know the trash mechanics. What I'm hoping for, though, is I'm hoping there's going to be a little bit of flexibility in terms of routing. That's something that I'm not a fan of currently in the current War Within season, and I'm not a fan of this new season in terms of dungeon layout. So think of Cinderbrew Meadery. Cinderbrew Meadery is a very linear dungeon. You have very strict hallways. You have a first boss room that you kind of need to clear all the trash based off of the mechanics that we're seeing in the dungeon journal and that we've seen on normal and heroic. And again, it's just very linear. Like you can choose which boss you want to go to first after the first boss, but you don't really get to choose what you're going to pull and what you're not going to pull outside of like nuanced skips with rogues, invisibility pots, or mind soothe. The Rookery, also a very linear dungeon. The only times you're going to be able to maybe flex like your route a little bit is at the start. Maybe you don't pull the full boss room. So what I'm really hoping for from Operation Floodgate is that it's not linear, but we can assume that it's like an operation. We can see some of the assets that they're using for both delves as well as the new zone. I think it's going to take place most likely inside, I would imagine, which means that there's going to be probably hallways and corridors, which means that routing is probably going to be fairly linear. So I'm hoping it's not, but most likely it's going to be. I think on the other hand, dungeons like Motherlode are very, very open. I guess now that I'm in it, let me kind of take a run back to the start of the dungeon and kind of show you what I'm talking about having linear versus non-linear dungeons. Halls of Atonement also, obviously it's not coming around, very non-linear dungeon. Now, Theater of Pain is very linear, similar to like the hallway issue that I have with Cinderbrew Meadery, but kind of the caveat is that after you kill first boss, you have 3 very distinct ways you can go, and in some of the wings, you also have different platforms you can kind of skip to, different hallways you can split down. There's a couple of invisibility routes in there as well. There's also some general skips you can just use with Mind Soothe or by just like waiting for good patrol timings. But basically, Motherlode starts off by you running down mid through this kind of just like corridor of houses. You get to like this little party room. And then in this area is where things really take off. You can hug the right-hand side, pull around the right. You can hug the left-hand side through kind of this building. You can go left. You can hug left or right here. You can kind of beeline it for the boss by skipping around some of these mobs. A lot of them are humanoids. You can mind soothe. You can like invis. You can just distract. You can do boss. You can back pull. This dungeon's very open. And as long as Blizzard does percent right, it'll be fine. But anyways, going back to Operation Floodgate, I'm hoping there's a little bit of structure. I'm hoping the boss mechanics are interesting and things that we haven't seen before. I think some like fights that have been standout, at least from this first season of Mythic Plus, that I think are unique in their kind of own way. I really like some of the bosses in Dawnbreaker. I like how Rashanon works. I really like the last boss of Arakara. I think that's kind of unique. City of Threads is also kind of cool. I really like the first boss, despite it being more difficult. I like bosses when we have like confined spaces, despite being in like a larger room. They've done a pretty good job at like boss and encounter design. So I'm hoping for good encounter designs, not a lot of casts, at least really important stops, because that's been getting kind of old in Mythic Plus. And I'm hoping for open routes. So that's what I'm hoping for the new dungeon specifically. Moving on to Motherlode. Motherlode has a lot of issues, but also a lot of like, I think Blizzard has the opportunity to make this dungeon very good. The benefit of this dungeon, or the cool things about this dungeon, is large pulls, not a lot of important casts, and a lot of interesting routing. The bosses are also very cool. I'm going to talk about them in a separate video. You have bosses that you get damage amps on. Actually, a lot of bosses you get damage amps on. There's bosses that you have to really control the floor space that you're working with because of like, zones that are created by the boss that'll deal damage to you. And then you get to control where you push those zones to. I think that's very fun when you're talking Ricks of Flux Flame. And then you have Mogul at the very end of the dungeon that I think has some interesting, cool mechanics that we haven't seen in a while, pretty much since Motherlode. Problems with the dungeon is percent. Most mobs in this dungeon are worth less than like 1%, so you have to pull a lot. Benefit, big pulls. Downside, a lot of big pulls. A lot of pulls, you're going to be spending a lot of time on trash. The dungeon is also very long. Originally, back in BFA, it was a 39-minute dungeon. That was without Fortified and Tyrannical being in play, so I think Blizzard's going to have to adjust some health pools. I think Blizzard's going to also have to... I'm hoping what they do, best case scenario, is they reduce a lot of health pools from bosses and trash by a fair amount. Keep percentages mostly the same to allow for a little bit of creativity in terms of routing, and then and they need to reduce the timer. They need to make it like a 36-minute dungeon or a 35-minute dungeon or whatever it might be. And so you can do more aggressive pulls, but they definitely have to tune some stuff down. There's a lot of things in here that are pretty crazy. I don't want to get into in this video. I'll do it in a separate video. Anyways, I'm pretty excited for this one. I think this is a good dungeon. I think a lot of people have fond memories. By the end of BFA, it was very good. Moving on, we have Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain was quite the dungeon. Let's see if can I pull this up on like Keystone Guru? So Keystone Guru should have some old routes in here. So we can look at something like Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain was interesting because, can I create a new route? Oh yeah, I can. Let's go. Fuck yeah. Just create a route. So Theater of Pain was interesting because like you had this very big first pull you could do. You could just pull everything onto the first boss. You can lust. You could just go fucking big dick. Awesome. Love that. You would go down, and then you have these 3 hallways. So you can either go into like the fighter wing, you can go into the caster wing, or you can go into the plague wing. And obviously, these are all very linear paths. Like you run into the room, I believe, from this side, right? Or is this down? This is downstairs, right? Am I crazy? Am I looking at the wrong shit? No, here's Gorechop. Wait, I'm so confused. No, okay, this is upstairs. They just have it backwards. So you run in, you have a bunch of trash in this first area, which again you can't really see because it's flipped. So the trash, you like do like a massive pull. You have like this group here that you can chain in, or you can skip around the rancid gas bag. You go downstairs, you have another big pull you get to do, and then you go on to boss. The boss is very fun. I liked Gorechop a lot. It had an interesting like movement mechanic with the hooks coming across the walls and stuff. Also, ad fights are always fun too because you just get like cleave and funnel. You know, you also have like the fighter wing. The fighter wing was a little bit more annoying because you had like this RNG, and everyone was talking about like, oh well, if you walk in while this mob is doing like a specific attack, it'll like you can force certain mobs. But there were some that were way better than others. I think Dorkig was way better than Nekthara. I'd have to go back and look at some Shadowlands video because I don't remember who was which. But basically, you had a wing that had like big AoE damage, and then you had this one where you did like mini bosses all the way to Zav, the Unfallen, and then you had Altars of Agony where you had like a lot of like these little trash mob pulls, like platforms. So you would like run up, jump to whatever platform you preferred. You either have like more of these shackled souls, or you had a 2-target cleave with the 2 bone maguses. There was also some interesting shit where you can like slow fall skip down to a different platform, so you could skip all of it. Which was interesting because I think if you just held W, you could end up actually pulling a lot of extra percent, which you didn't really want to do. Kind of a downside of this dungeon. But like pretty fun pulls. I mean, we're no longer going to have these like relics because this is season 3 of Shadowlands. But overall, I would say like a fairly fun dungeon nonetheless. You had like fairly large pulls, a couple of alternative routes, depending on what you want to go. If you had like a 3-minute based comp, like with like, Boomkin or now Enhance or Elemental Shaman and Warlock, you would pull the dungeon differently because your classes had different CDs, which is just kind of like overall enjoyable. I'm generally happy with Theater of Pain. My only thing is like a little too linear with route, like in terms of percentage. And then 5 boss dungeons, I'm not a fan of. It's going to be a little bit different because it's no longer a fortified versus tyrannical. It's now you have both of them active, and if you're doing higher keys. But that was always a concern I had with tyrannical 5 boss dungeons. Is like this was such a difficult tyrannical dungeon for a lot of groups. Overall though, I'm pleased that they picked this one over other dungeons. I was not looking forward to maybe like people were like predicting Shrine of the Storms and stuff. Not a big fan of that. Other Shadowlands dungeons weren't looking too great. Like I didn't want to go to Plaguefall. I didn't want to go to Spires of Ascension. Halls of Atonement would have been good. Sanguine Depths would have been good for me personally, but overall, I'm very happy with Theater of Pain choice. You now have Mechagon. Mechagon is easily one of my favorite dungeons of all time outside of Tazavesh. Tazavesh, both Gambit as well as Streets, were probably my 2 favorite dungeons of all time. Halls of Atonement is up there as well. But Mechagon, what I liked about Mechagon is that the boss fights were so unique, both in Junkyard and in Workshop, but Workshop had, I think, some of the more interesting bosses. A lot of cool tech that you can do both on the first boss, the second boss, and the third boss, actually. First boss, going up to first boss, had some cool stuff you can do, like with killing the ads, like solo tanking the ads and killing them. Actually, you know what? I have a YouTube video talking about it. Let's see if I can pull that up really quick. So here's young Shah. You can't really see me, but I'm in this corner here. Here's young Shah wearing the same hat that I'm wearing right now, talking about how you can solo these mobs. So what you would do is you would be the only person who would run into this room. I would Door of Shadows in. This is a Shadowlands thing. This is in a 24 workshop. And so these swirls that this rocket barrage would actually kill, they would kill themselves. So these swirls would just kill everything for my group. And now the trash is dead. My group is now going to come running down. So there's some cool tech with that. This boss fight's relatively fun. And then there's just like good boss fights. Here, let me kind of go into this. I have this thing going. So this is like, this is BFA. This is BFA Mechagon. I was very bad back in the day. Lots of cool bosses. I thought KUJO was a fun boss fight. A lot of cool tech with Vanish, a lot of cool tech with like Meld. The way you could position the boss to get extra damage. Now, obviously, I'm not doing it right here because I was bad at the game, but you would be able to line of sight and hug the edge and still do damage to this boss. Quaking obviously was a problem. Quaking was obviously a problem on this fight. Cool night elf tech, mage tech, rogue tech on that fight. You'd have to run up this conveyor belt. I thought this next gauntlet was very fun. A lot of cool mind control tech, a lot of cool spell reflect tech that you can do. My only issue with dungeons like this is it's very bottleneck-like, where to activate the first boss, you have to kill the first pack. To activate or to get past this area, you had to kill each set of the gauntlet one at a time. There's no way to fast track anything here. So there was a couple of issues with that, but for the most part, pretty enjoyable dungeon. I thought all the boss fights were really fun. These generators, very cool. You can gain a debuff by standing in it to reduce the damage you take by 75%. I like when you use mobs' abilities against themselves. I think that's always a fun design. It makes it feel a little bit more realistic in terms of combat, because like you have these deadly things happening, and it's weird for mobs not to take damage from their own spells, and vice versa. It'd be kind of interesting if, like, as a bear, I was thrashing and fucking putting a bleed on my allies. Now, obviously, I don't advocate for that, but I do like when things like this shield generators apply to both the enemies, but also to you. It makes sense that if you stand in the defense of the enemy, that you also gain that defense, right? It'd be very funny if you put down darkness, though, and, like, the mobs you were hitting also had darkness effect on them. That'd just be fucking goofy. Anyways, very fun dungeon, except for Head Machinist. This guy is a fucking big pain in the ass. This fight gets super hectic. If I, like, fast forward a little bit later in the fight, you're going to see, like, just a clusterfuck of, like, swirls. These blades are moving around. There's beams you're dodging. This concussion grenade is way bigger now, which is obnoxious. So yeah, this fight gets really hectic on the high tyrannical keys. Lucky for us, in this key run 4 years ago now, it was fortified, so this guy died really quickly. Just very hectic fight, very punishing fight. As you can see, I ended up dying here. Luckily, I think they end up actually soloing the guy. I get a battle res at the very end, but we just release. But again, a very bottleneck-like, because what ends up happening is, like, you have to kill these spider tanks, or you have to kill this spider tank to activate the skip to get up to the next boss area. So, like, there's some, like, bottleneck issues. There's obviously the linear routing thing that I'm going to complain about in every dungeon. That's a little obnoxious, that you have to, like, frickin' just blast. You have to hold W. You can skip, like, one pack, but you have to commit an invis or have a rogue with you. So, yeah, I think overall the dungeon pool is looking very good. There's a couple of issues I have with some of the current War Within dungeons that we're going to be seeing. Mainly Sacred Flame is the one concern that I have. I think the trash in this dungeon is going to be obnoxious. A lot of casts, a lot of sharpshooter / archer mobs, which means they have to be displaced or line of sighted to be grouped up. A lot of tertiary group damage going on. The boss fights are not particularly interesting, which is a shame. Obviously, I haven't seen the mythic versions of these fights, but on heroic and normal, and like that, what we've seen on things like beta, as well as the start of the expansion, and you could just run now, especially in like follower dungeons. Very boring boss fights. Nothing too interesting happening. Benefit of this dungeon, or cool thing that's going on, is that there are options for routing in here, which I like. I always appreciate a dungeon where you get to choose and pick what packs you get to pull, as long as they're not like, oh, you have to pull the whole dungeon like they did with Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake, I think, is a poor example of what a dungeon should be. It's a hold W and then some. You have to, like, pull a bunch of extra random shit just to get your percent, which is just, like, not fun. It wasn't hard for groups to pull around the trash, and instead Blizzard's like, nah, you're gonna have to pull an extra fucking gatekeeper or two. You're gonna have to pull that center pack regardless. Like, it's something that I'm not, like, super into, and I don't like that philosophy. People are really shitting on Darkflame Cleft. I don't think this dungeon's going to be bad. I think trash leading up to Waxbeard is really bad, but all the trash between Waxbeard and the Darkness I think is fine. I have a strategy for the Darkness that I'm eventually going to show probably later, once like PTR realms are up. I'm gonna talk about the strategy you use for the gauntlet leading up to this boss. I think it's going to make things a lot easier. I think people are shitting on this boss, or this dungeon, too much. I think it's going to be very fun. It's very thematic. It's very cool. It's like kobold and candles. You're going to have fun in this dungeon, I think. Most of the boss fights are actually very fun, too. I think the only boss fight that's going to be really weird is the Darkness. It's going to be very gimmicky. It's going to feel similar to Rashanan, where it's like, it's really going to rely on your healer to do the mechanic, and everyone else is just going to like stand beta frontal and it's going to be fine. The trash leading up to the first boss is very annoying though. Yeah, you have like mobs that can knock mobs, which again, I just advocated that that's fun when mobs can affect each other, but it's not fun because they get scattered. A lot of them are mobs that can't be moved simply just by like kicking them. They have to be like line of sighted or gripped, and that's not fun. Cinderbrew Meadery, I have an issue with routing in here. It's very linear, as well as it's going to be very punishing for tanks. You're going to want to be a dwarf, you're going to want to have an immunity, or you're going to want to have like insane healing like being a Death Knight. Outside of that, this dungeon is going to be pretty good, except again, my arguments is just very linear, and I don't like that structure. I don't like where you hold W, pull 102, 105% trash, and just like that's your route, and you can't really do anything about it. And then the last dungeon that I'm most excited for is the Rookery 3-boss dungeon. Love 3-boss dungeons. Outside of the weird little bit of a Spires of Ascension feel at the start of the dungeon where you like rescue the little griffin dudes and then you fly across. Mostly large pulls, low kick counts, fun boss fights that are a little bit interesting, and a little bit of fluctuation with route. You can choose to pull very big at the start. You can skip some stuff in the first boss room if you really want to. Out after you kill first boss, it's very linear, but like I think there's a lot of agency at the start of the dungeon, which is good. I think this is the best of the 4, but we're gonna have to wait and see. So that's my thought on the season. I think it's gonna be fun. The last thing I kind of want to talk about is dungeon tuning versus like static dungeon pools like we've seen in Legion, BFA, and pretty much most of Shadowlands versus the rotating dungeon pool we have now. Because I think this is kind of an important thing to talk about. Dungeon pools now, we obviously are used to this rotating dungeon pool. That's very common. And I think most people are on board with it. And I am too. I love it. The only thing and the caveat with this is that Blizzard has to be very good about tuning these dungeons properly. What we saw in Dragonflight was a very, very rough attempt from Blizzard to try to like, it's growing pains essentially. Because like, imagine like for people who play the start of Dragonflight, like Ruby Life Pool's miserable dungeon at the start. Way too high of a heal check for most encounters as well as the trash. Very punishing like one-shot mechanics. Same with Azure Vault. Like tanks got destroyed in Azure Vault. That was a miserable dungeon. Timer was too tight. And a lot of the tuning didn't happen until the very end of the season, or it didn't happen until like season 3 when those dungeons made a return, or season 4. So Blizzard, when you have a rotating dungeon pool, Blizzard needs to be a little bit more proactive about tuning things quick and biting things in the ass. They did a pretty good job in the War Within. I think there's some standouts. I think Grim Batol needs some adjustments still, but most of the dungeons are fairly good. Oh, also City of Threads. But most of the dungeons are doable. You know, you have obviously the standouts like Miss Eterna Scythe, Arakara, arguably Necrotic Wake, and then you have like obviously like Grim Batol and City of Threads. But for the most part, most of the dungeons feel fairly well balanced, and I think Blizzard's doing a good job at that. But if we look back at like Dragonflight as a sample, they did not do a good job. So I really like the rotating dungeons when Blizzard is actively tuning things. But there's a benefit to having a static dungeon pool, which obviously we're not going to go back to anytime soon. But having a static dungeon pool meant players really got to learn the dungeons. But it got to the point where you weren't learning the dungeons, you were learning the affixes and how to work with them, especially the seasonal affixes. So there's a little bit to be said there. Tuning felt a lot better when the dungeons were around. Blizzard really had time to fine tune everything. People really got to learn the dungeons, so then eventually got to the point where everyone knew what to do in Motherlode. Everyone knew what to do in Ataldazar. Everyone knew what to do in Shrine of Storms. It really came down to, oh, we have this new seasonal affix. Oh, we have this other set of affixes that we now need to deal with. Oh, it's Sanguine Week, so we have to take this a little bit differently than we normally would. Where now, especially with the new affixes, which I think are amazing, especially in like lower content, and then when you get to higher content, you have to deal with them. With the new affixes, you kind of play the affixes, but you play them not often enough. Generally, they don't overlap with bad mechanics. You know, there's some standouts like Arakara, for example, like the last boss, the second boss too, with like the orbs. That's annoying to play with. But generally speaking, you don't have to play the affix anymore. You play the dungeon, you learn from it. The tuning's been pretty good. So I'm a big advocate for the rotating dungeons. And I'm happy that they're going against kind of the status quo, introducing a new dungeon, using a dungeon that we've already seen before get recycled. But all in all, it's just all around a good thing. So I really like this dungeon pool. I'm excited to see what PTR is going to look like. I'm going to be testing that a bunch once it comes out. But anyways, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. This is kind of an impromptu video. I just wanted to talk, share my opinion about everything. And then I'm going to be doing a little walk down memory lane for a lot of these other dungeons over the next upcoming days. So if you're interested in seeing that, yeah, follow, subscribe, whatever you do here on YouTube. Anyways, hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.